important summaries that we need to get. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Hice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. Mr. Graves, I'd like to begin with you. So far as it relates to public-private partnerships, there's been great success, Colorado, Montana, other examples that are very, very encouraging regarding the abandoned hard rock mines. So with that in mind, what kind of guidance or assistance would you need from us, from the federal government, to help enable reclamation projects at the state level?
I guess it's less guidance, it's more protection. I mean, we've been talking about good SAMs as a whole, and I think what sometimes gets lost in that broader discussion is that states really are a good SAM in most of these cases, and also, because we're acting as a good SAM, need those same kind of liability protections. Just because we're a state doing a cleanup doesn't mean that we're free from long-term liability associated with the cleanup.
All right, and so that would apply to states whether they already have programs and that type of thing or not.
Correct.
The issue, number one issue would be protection.
Correct.
Okay, assuming that's kind of across the board, would most of you agree with that? Okay. One other question for you. What factors do you think should be taken into account when delegating responsibilities of a program oversight to the states?
That's an excellent question. I think it needs to be a well thought out program in terms of oversight and recognizing that the work that's being conducted obviously comes with certain risks associated with it. So sufficient review of projects by appropriate people. I'm sure there's other things I could think of in the future, but.
All right, would anyone else like to address that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Hice. I think in Montana, we feel that because we have primacy on the Clean Water Act in Montana, and also we have, other regulations that would, be over these Good Samaritan projects, that the federal guidance that comes down, we would also like primacy on that in Montana to determine who is and who is not a Good Samaritan. And we really like the process in either the Pennsylvania example or community reclaimers, where these Good Samaritans come to the state, form a partnership with the state, and then in that, the liability protections would be extended.
Okay, good. Mr. Wood, let me ask you this, because your organization has certainly been a part of these reclamation projects in states across the country. So with what all y'all have done, what elements of a state program makes public-private partnerships effective? What do we need to know that makes this whole thing work?
Well, we were commenting earlier before the hearing, the relationships that we have in the two states that are represented here are phenomenal. There's no daylight between the work that we're doing with our partners in Colorado or the state in Montana. So I think that sort of partnership needs to be really strong and maintained. And I think, as was just said, leaving discretion to the state, as much discretion to the state to set the kind of standards they want to set, I think is appropriate.
All right, so you think the states need to have a more powerful voice than the federal government?
Well, in places where the Clean Water Act authority has been delegated to the state, it's probably appropriate that they would set the standards.
Which makes sense. I mean, they're closer to the problem, so I mean their interest is and one size doesn't fit all. This can't be just a cookie cutter thing. And so is that more or less what you're saying?
More or less.
Okay. Anyone else on that? Anybody want to add to it? All right.
Yeah, one of the impediments that we found with working with the federal government in particular is from a contracting standpoint. It has been much easier working contractually with an NGO like Trout Unlimited than it has been with the U.S. Forest Service. Our local government entity receives grant monies from Montana DEQ, Department of Natural Resources in Montana, and then enters into, at least on some of our CERCLA projects with the U.S. Forest Service, enters into contracts with them, and they administer the actual work. But the contracting for those projects is a significant burden and impediment, and so I would say engaging local government in the discussion would be important.
Well, excellent. Again, I want to say thank you to each of you. This has been very insightful. and informative, and I appreciate it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. They just called votes, but we'll have time. Mr. Giaforte, you recognize for